For 2,000 years, the Rhine had stood as Europe's last and greatest natural barrier. From the legions of Rome to the soldiers of Napoleon, it had represented more than a river. It was a symbol of protection, of permanence, of Germany's unbreakable heart. And yet, in March of 1945, that symbol was rendered meaningless, not by tanks, not by strategy, but by something few had ever imagined: a truck that could swim. As the spring thaw spread across western Germany, Allied armies approached the Rhine's western bank. Behind them lay the wreckage of Europe. Ahead stood the last obstacle before the heart of the Reich. The river stretched wide, cold and swift, a natural moat behind which the German command had vowed to make its final stand. To them, the Rhine was destiny's wall. But the men who stood on the opposite shore, weary from months of advance through Belgium and France, saw not a fortress, but a challenge to be overcome by ingenuity. Among their ranks were the soldiers of the U.S. 79th Infantry Division, and with them the unheralded 336th Amphibious Truck Company, crews of peculiar vehicles unlike anything the world had ever seen. They called them DUKWs, six-wheeled, steel-bodied trucks with the hull of a boat and the soul of Detroit industry. By the spring of 1945, over 21,000 of these ungainly ducks had rolled off American assembly lines. To the untrained eye, they were crude: rough welds, olive drab paint, and the appearance of something half-finished. Yet each one carried a promise that rivers, lakes, and even oceans would no longer dictate the pace of war. The Germans had expected the Allies to cross at only a few points where bridges could be captured or pontoon spans built under cover of darkness. They had filled the riverbanks with mines, artillery, and anti-tank guns, confident that any attempt would drown in blood. What they had not anticipated was that the enemy would simply drive across the river as if it were another road. In the early hours of March 23, 1945, under a pale moon, the first DUKWs rolled into the dark waters of the Rhine. Their engines growled against the current, their propellers churning through the black tide. The soldiers aboard held their breath as tracer fire laced the sky above. The river hissed with the sound of shrapnel. Yet the DUKWs kept moving, steady, deliberate, unstoppable. On the far bank, German soldiers stared in disbelief. Through the mist, shapes emerged. Trucks, not boats, climbing up from the river as if the Rhine itself had given birth to them. Within hours, hundreds more followed. What had once been a barrier was now a highway. A German officer later wrote, "We did everything correctly according to our doctrine. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river's existence." This was not a failure of courage or skill, but of imagination. For years, the Wehrmacht had perfected the art of warfare: the swift, armored advance, the disciplined counterattack, the calculated defense. But they had built their doctrine upon the assumption that nature itself could still be trusted to hold the line. The Americans had broken that assumption, not with genius, but with industry. When the Allies reached the Rhine, they brought with them not only soldiers but factories, production lines, and the mechanical confidence of a nation that measured power in quantity. Each DUKW had been assembled in less than a day, its parts interchangeable, its construction simple. What it lacked in beauty, it made up for in numbers. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, would later admit from captivity, "The Americans perfected the business of war. We Germans perfected the art of it. At the Rhine, business defeated art." It was an astonishing confession, and a profound truth. The crossing itself lasted barely 72 hours. More than 15,000 men and 1,200 vehicles made their way across the Rhine under fire. Over 3,000 tons of supplies followed, and when it was over, the myth of the Rhine as Germany's eternal shield lay in ruins. General Dwight Eisenhower would later write, "Without the DUKW, the Rhine would have been a killing ground. With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday." It was a simple statement, but one that captured the essence of this quiet miracle of logistics. For the soldiers who rode the DUKWs across those dark waters, the memory never faded. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company would recall years later, the same DUKW that crossed the Rhine under fire was later delivering food to German children. They'd chase us calling out, "Schwimmwagen, Schwimmwagen." Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives after it. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same ungainly machines that had defied the river's current would soon ferry bread, blankets, and medicine to the very people whose armies had sought to destroy them. The DUKW became more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of transformation, of how war itself had changed. Once, wars were fought by men of strategy and courage. Now, they were won by those who could build, transport, and innovate faster than their enemy could imagine. Behind every DUKW was not just a crew of soldiers, but an army of unseen hands. Welders, engineers, factory girls, machinists, the quiet chorus of industrial America. They were the anonymous victors of the Rhine. As one German observer later wrote, "We watched the Americans cross the Rhine not as warriors, but as engineers. Their strength was not in their arms, but in their factories." In that moment, the nature of warfare itself shifted. Geography, which had shaped Europe's destiny for centuries, was rendered irrelevant by assembly lines and production schedules. The Rhine, once a line of defense, became a test of imagination, one the Germans had already lost before the first DUKW touched the water. What happened on that March night was more than a crossing. It was a revelation. A new kind of power had emerged. Quiet, methodical, industrial. The kind of power that did not depend on valor alone, but on organization, production, and the relentless rhythm of machines. The Rhine was not conquered that week. It was outproduced. The Rhine's waters, dark and restless, carried more than soldiers and steel that March. They carried the weight of an idea that modern war would no longer be determined by genius, but by production. The DUKW, that ungainly floating truck, was the physical expression of this philosophy, practical, unsophisticated, yet unstoppable. In the months before the crossing, American factories had turned into living organisms. The great assembly lines of Detroit, Pontiac, and St. Louis beat like the arteries of a single industrial heart. They worked without pause, night and day, pouring out weapons, tanks, aircraft, and DUKWs, thousands of them, each one identical to the last, each one capable of transforming from truck to boat in seconds. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, once visited one of those assembly lines. He stood among the roar of engines and the smell of hot metal and oil and watched 6 DUKWs roll off the line in a single hour. They were rough, he would later say, their welds uneven, their paint dull, their form inelegant, but each one would cross the Rhine. He compared this to the German factories he had studied before the war. There, a single amphibious vehicle might take a month to build. Handcrafted, carefully tested, and nearly perfect. The difference was profound. Germany had mastered the art of precision. America had mastered the art of replication. And replication, it turned out, was far more lethal. The German equivalent of the DUKW, the Landwasser Schlepper, or LWS, was a masterpiece of engineering. It was large, armored, and complex, the sort of machine that could only be built by specialists. But when Allied bombers shattered Germany's supply lines, the precision parts that fed its production vanished. One missing gear, one damaged mold, and the assembly halted completely. In America, if a factory ran short on parts, another factory simply shipped replacements. If the steel ran out, the War Production Board diverted more from shipbuilding. If a tool broke, an engineer improvised a substitute. Flexibility replaced perfection. That was the quiet genius of the DUKW. It didn't require perfection to function, only persistence. The philosophy was simple. Build enough, and victory becomes inevitable. By early 1945, 21,000 DUKWs had been produced. Alongside them, more than 500,000 standard trucks shared their components: engines, transmissions, steering systems, so that one could repair the other. The same foundries that poured steel for amphibious hulls were also building Liberty ships every 2 days. It was an orchestra of efficiency, playing a symphony of mass production. The Germans, watching the Allied advance, saw this with growing despair. Reports from captured officers revealed disbelief. One Wehrmacht engineer, interrogated after the war, confessed, "We assumed the Americans would attempt crossings at bridges. We never imagined they had thousands of trucks that could swim." For the defenders of the Rhine, this revelation arrived too late. As the Allied DUKWs poured across the river, carrying men, supplies, and even artillery, German defenses began to crumble from within. Soldiers who had once believed in the river's invincibility now saw it violated by an army of steel and rubber. In the bunkers of Wesel and Ries, morale broke faster than the walls themselves. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding the Western defenses, noted bitterly, "When word spread that the Rhine was crossed by swimming vehicles, our men lost heart. They asked, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can?" He had no answer. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. In Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals, demanding explanations. In his final military conference weeks later, he would mutter, "The Rhine was lost because we did not anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared for the wrong war." It was one of the few moments of clarity he ever displayed. What had taken centuries to defend was undone in days, and not by superior tactics, but by industrial imagination. For the Americans, the crossing was not a moment of triumph, but of inevitability. The soldiers who drove the DUKWs were not engineers or scientists. They were citizen soldiers, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Ohio, factory workers from Michigan, operating machines born from their own communities. The DUKW was an extension of who they were: practical, adaptable, and relentlessly determined. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison remembered the feeling vividly. The Rhine looked endless that night, but when the engine started, when the propeller hit the water, it didn't feel like a river anymore. It felt like a road. A wet one, but a road all the same. When the DUKWs reached the far bank, their crews did not cheer. They simply shifted gears and drove inland, leaving the river behind as if it had never existed. The crossing lasted 72 hours. In that time, 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, and over 3,000 tons of supplies made it safely across. It was one of the most complex logistical feats in modern history, yet it unfolded with the mechanical precision of a production line. This was the genius of American warfare, the ability to turn chaos into process. To the Germans, this seemed almost inhuman. War had always been the realm of courage and tactics, of risk and valor, but the Americans treated it like an engineering problem. Every river could be crossed, every obstacle dismantled, every shortage solved by manufacturing. It was not romantic, but it was effective. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, later reflected that Germany had been defeated by the business of war. He was right. Where German officers saw battlefields, American planners saw assembly lines. For the first time in history, industry itself had become a weapon. And it was not just a weapon of destruction, but of transformation. The DUKW that carried infantry across the Rhine would soon carry loaves of bread to German children. The same propeller that churned through gunfire would later cut through floodwaters to deliver medicine and relief. When the guns finally fell silent, many DUKWs remained in service, not to conquer, but to rebuild. In the months after Germany's surrender, they ferried survivors from concentration camps, transported supplies to starving villages, and helped repair the bridges they had once rendered obsolete. One American soldier wrote in his diary, "Funny thing, the same duck that carried rifles into Germany now carries milk. The Rhine, once stained with the smoke of battle, now reflected sunlight off the ripples of those same vehicles. Trucks that had crossed under fire, now gliding peacefully across the water with children waving from the shore." In the end, perhaps that was the truest victory of all, that instruments of war could so quickly become tools of mercy. The DUKW, born from necessity, had become a bridge between destruction and redemption, a machine that embodied the strange, enduring paradox of human invention. It had conquered the Rhine, but in doing so, it had shown that power was not in perfection, but in adaptability. The Rhine had fallen, but something greater had risen, a new understanding of what war and peace could be. The morning after the Rhine crossing, a fog hung low over the water, thin, silver, and ghost-like. The air was heavy with the smell of oil, damp canvas, and river silt. The DUKWs rested quietly along the western bank, their hulls streaked with mud and smoke as if they too were weary from battle. The soldiers who manned them slept where they could, some inside the trucks, some in shallow dugouts beside the river. Their faces were smeared with soot and fatigue, yet behind the exhaustion there was something else, a stillness that came not from triumph, but from comprehension. They understood that they had witnessed something larger than victory. The Rhine had been more than a river. It had been a symbol, the last natural barrier protecting Hitler's Reich. For centuries, it had divided nations, cultures, and armies. But now, it had been crossed by machines that defied both geography and fear. And in that crossing, the myth of German invincibility dissolved like smoke in the morning sun. As dawn brightened the water, the DUKWs began to move again. Their engines growled softly, pushing ripples across the river's glassy surface. Each one carried something new: crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, or columns of infantry bound for the far shore. The operation was no longer a battle. It was a procession. Captain Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, watched the movement from a ridge above the river. He later wrote, "It was not courage that carried us across the Rhine. It was planning. It was organization. It was the sum of 10,000 decisions made by men who would never see the front." Behind those decisions lay a story not of generals, but of engineers. When the DUKW was first conceived in 1942, few believed it could succeed. The U.S. Army had requested an amphibious truck capable of navigating rough seas, climbing beaches, and driving inland without maintenance. The concept was dismissed by many as absurd. "A truck that swims," one general sneered, "is a truck that sinks." But the engineers at General Motors thought differently. Under the leadership of naval architect Rod Stevens and yacht designer Dennis Pouliston, they took a standard six-wheel GMC truck and wrapped it in a watertight hull. They added a propeller, a bilge pump, and a steering system that worked both on land and water. The prototype was crude, but it worked. When Pouliston first drove it into Boston Harbor, observers laughed. Then they fell silent as the ungainly vehicle floated, accelerated, and climbed back onto the dock without hesitation. "It looked like a joke," Pouliston later said, "until it didn't." The DUKW's name came from its manufacturing code: D for 1942, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for 2 rear axles. But to the men who relied on it, the name Duck felt right. It waddled awkwardly on land, glided gracefully on water, and survived almost anything. By the time of the Rhine crossing, the design had been refined and field-tested through countless operations: Sicily, Normandy, Anzio, and the Pacific Islands. Each theater had taught new lessons: how to reinforce the hull against shrapnel, how to adjust tire pressure automatically for sand or mud, how to load artillery pieces without capsizing. Every DUKW carried within it the memory of past battles. In that way, each one was a living history of adaptation. As the Allied armies advanced eastward, the DUKW became indispensable. Bridges could be destroyed, but rivers could no longer stop them. Supply lines flowed unbroken from the Normandy beaches to the heart of Germany. In Eisenhower's headquarters, logistical officers began referring to the DUKWs as the arteries of the Army. One colonel joked, "We no longer build bridges, we float them." The Germans, observing from the opposite bank, were stunned not by the technology itself, but by the sheer number of vehicles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported hundreds of amphibious trucks crossing simultaneously, each one carrying tons of equipment. It seemed less like an army crossing a river and more like the river itself had chosen to move. When captured German officers were later interrogated, their responses revealed disbelief. One said, "We had studied every bridge along the Rhine. We prepared to destroy them all, but no one prepared for trucks that needed no bridges. To them, it was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was inevitable." The DUKW symbolized more than engineering. It represented a mindset. It was the embodiment of what historian Arthur Herman would later call the industrial democracy of war. Every bolt, every plate, every turn of its propeller came from a place where ordinary citizens had contributed: a Detroit foundry, a Kansas steel mill, a Cleveland tire factory. Unlike Germany's centralized, rigid war economy, America's production system thrived on decentralization. Small workshops supplied parts to larger plants. Independent inventors submitted improvements. Workers suggested assembly line efficiencies that engineers adopted overnight. The result was a living ecosystem of innovation, agile, adaptive, and self-correcting. And the DUKW was its perfect offspring. In the final weeks of the war, as Allied divisions rolled toward the Elbe and beyond, the DUKW's presence became almost invisible, a background constant, like the hum of an engine or the rhythm of marching boots. Yet without it, nothing would have moved. General George Patton, never one to praise machinery, admitted as much. "My men can fight without tanks," he said, "but they cannot fight without ducks." The DUKW bridged more than rivers. It bridged the gap between imagination and necessity, between what war demanded and what human ingenuity could provide. In the towns they liberated, civilians watched these strange vehicles roll ashore from flooded riverbanks carrying food instead of shells, blankets instead of bullets. To them, it seemed like a miracle. Trucks that came from the water, bringing life instead of death. One French child in Strasbourg later recalled, "We saw the Americans arrive not on the roads, but from the river. They came from the water like something out of a dream." And indeed, for Europe it was a dream. The dream of liberation, carried on 6 wheels and a steel hull. As the front lines advanced deeper into Germany, the DUKWs moved with them, ferrying not just soldiers but the invisible lifeblood of an army: fuel, rations, and hope. Their propellers churned the waters of the Rhine, the Weser, and finally the Elbe. Rivers that had once divided Europe, now united under the relentless logic of progress. In the end, the DUKW did not merely conquer geography. It conquered the Old World's belief that wars were won by glory. It proved they were won by logistics, by foresight, by the unglamorous genius of design. The Rhine had been a test, not just of courage but of civilization's ability to adapt faster than destruction. And in that test, the DUKW, humble and uncelebrated, became the unlikely hero. By late March 1945, the thunder of artillery had rolled eastward, and the Rhine, that ancient frontier of Europe, lay behind the Allies. What once divided empires had become a highway. On its waters drifted hundreds of DUKWs, still glistening with the mud of battle, ferrying men and machines toward the fading roar of war. In their wake lay shattered bridges, burnt barges, and the ruins of cities that had stood for centuries. Yet, amid the wreckage, the DUKW's wake cut a line of continuity. It carried not only supplies, but a message. The world was crossing into something new. In the first days after the crossing, Allied High Command faced a dilemma. The German army, though broken, still resisted fiercely in pockets east of the Rhine. Cities like Essen and Hamburg were reduced to ashes, their streets impassable. Traditional trucks bogged down in craters and rubble. But the DUKWs, unbothered by broken roads, rolled through flooded streets, turning rivers and ruins alike into avenues. They became, in a sense, amphibious lifelines. Private Charles Henson of the 79th Infantry Division later described it simply: "You could drop us anywhere, river, swamp, city street, and the ducks would find a way through. It didn't matter what was in front of us. They just kept going." That ability to keep going, to adapt to whatever the world presented, reflected more than engineering. It reflected a philosophy that had defined the Allied war effort, that flexibility was strength, and that creativity, not control, was the key to survival. While the DUKWs pressed forward with supplies, another kind of battle began behind them, the battle to feed and rebuild the liberated lands. From the Low Countries to Bavaria, millions of civilians were starving. Roads were gone. Railways were twisted wrecks of steel. And so, once again, the DUKWs took to the water. They ferried flour, medicine, and blankets along the same routes they had used to carry ammunition and fuel. On one April morning near Dusseldorf, an American driver named Henry Wallace watched children running along the banks of the flooded Ruhr River as his DUKWs approached. "They waved at us like we were ships," he recalled. "We weren't soldiers to them. We were deliverers." The transformation was quiet but profound. The same machines that had broken the enemy's resistance were now repairing the peace. Even German civilians, once taught to see these vehicles as instruments of invasion, began to look at them differently. In one small town near Mainz, a DUKW crew discovered that the local population had hung a sign beside the riverbank, reading, in broken English, "Welcome, floating trucks. Bring bread." In those months, the DUKW became a bridge not just across water, but between enemies. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, logistics officers began referring to this period as the Second Crossing, the passage from war to peace. And again, the DUKWs led the way. They transported displaced persons across rivers, carried Red Cross nurses into bombed cities, and hauled rebuilding materials to sites where bridges were being reconstructed. In May, when Germany finally surrendered, the DUKWs were still at work. At Lübeck Bay, they helped evacuate tens of thousands of survivors from Nazi camps, moving them gently across shallow waters where no other transport could reach. For many of those rescued, the first breath of freedom came aboard the same steel hulls that had once borne the symbols of war. A British officer watching from shore wrote, "It is a strange sight. These gray, homely vehicles gliding across the water, carrying the wounded, the broken, and the hungry. They look almost biblical, as if they were Noah's arks for a shattered world." When the fighting finally ended, there was a question of what to do with them. Thousands of DUKWs now sat idle, their engines still strong, their hulls still sound. Some were shipped to the Pacific for the final battles against Japan. Others were sold or loaned to civilian agencies. A few were simply left behind in Europe, their faded olive paint soon covered by the dust of peacetime. But even there, their story didn't end. In the years that followed, the DUKW found a new life in disaster relief. Floods struck the Netherlands in 1953, the United Kingdom in 1947, and later even the Mississippi River in America itself. And each time, DUKWs reappeared from storage, roaring back into service. Their propellers churned through rising waters carrying food, doctors, and rescue workers. A vehicle built for war had become a savior in peace. Many of those who had once driven them in combat volunteered again, unable to forget the machines that had carried them across the Rhine. "It's funny," one veteran wrote. "I drove that duck through bullets and now I drive her through floodwater. Feels the same, only this time nobody's shooting." In Germany, too, the DUKWs remained for years, helping rebuild bridges, clear wreckage, and reconnect the divided nation. The irony was not lost on observers. The same American trucks that had shattered the myth of German industrial supremacy were now helping to restore it. And in that irony lay a deeper truth, that progress, once unleashed, has no allegiance. The same hands that forged weapons can rebuild civilizations. Historians would later note that the DUKW's success was not merely mechanical. It represented the culmination of a worldview, that problems could be solved through design, through iteration, through will. It was the embodiment of democratic engineering, built quickly, shared widely, and adaptable by anyone who needed it. Its simplicity was its genius. In a war defined by machines of terror, the V-2 rockets, the Panther tanks, the jet fighters, the DUKW stood apart. It was not elegant nor fearsome. It was practical. And, in the end, practicality outlasted perfection. When peace returned to Europe, many DUKWs were painted in bright colors and used by local fire brigades or ferry companies. In Paris, one was seen carrying tourists along the Seine, gliding under bridges it had once helped rebuild. In Amsterdam, a fleet of former military DUKWs became the first amphibious taxis in the world. Their dull khaki paint had faded, but their spirit remained. In a sense, they were still crossing rivers. Only now they carried families, laughter, and new beginnings. The Rhine, once a boundary of blood, had become a ribbon of commerce and culture again. And somewhere along its quiet banks, the faint echo of engines still lingered, a reminder of a time when the world learned that even in its darkest hour, humanity could build something that floated. The DUKW had begun as an experiment in wartime necessity. It ended as a lesson in human resilience. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of war was fading into silence. Across the Rhine, columns of DUKWs moved steadily eastward, their olive hulls gleaming in the pale European light. The sound of their engines, once the heartbeat of invasion, now echoed across a continent exhausted by 6 years of war. The rivers they had conquered now carried peace. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8th, the soldiers who had ridden those strange amphibious trucks looked back and realized that they had witnessed something far greater than a tactical success. They had seen the moment when human imagination overtook geography itself, when the oldest barrier in Europe ceased to be an obstacle and became a pathway. General Eisenhower would later write in his final report, "No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from limitation into advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months." And he was right, for in the DUKW, the Allies had found not merely a machine, but a metaphor, a symbol of a world learning to move past its limits. Even the German officers who survived the war came to recognize its meaning. In the cold clarity of defeat, they spoke not of enemy generals or superior tactics, but of something deeper. "We were defeated in Detroit's factories," wrote one captured colonel, "not on the Rhine's banks." Another, General Guderian himself, reflected, "We Germans perfected the art of war. The Americans perfected the business of war. At the Rhine, business defeated art." It was a blunt admission, but a true one. For decades, military historians would debate what truly won the war: strategy, leadership, courage, or sheer production. But those who were there, knee-deep in the Rhine's freezing waters, knew the answer was simpler. Victory came on the back of a machine that could swim. The DUKW embodied everything that made Allied victory possible. Not perfection, but pragmatism. Not genius, but cooperation. Not brilliance, but belief. It was born not from laboratories, but from factories. It was not the product of one brilliant mind, but of thousands of ordinary hands. Welders, engineers, draftsmen, women on assembly lines. All had contributed to a creation that would change the course of history. It is often said that war reveals the soul of a nation. If that is true, then the DUKW revealed the soul of America, inventive, resourceful, and endlessly adaptable. And yet, even as it helped destroy the Third Reich, it also pointed toward what would come after, a new world built on mobility, on industry, on the idea that anything could be made to move forward. In the post-war years, the DUKW's descendants would carry explorers across Antarctica, aid workers through floods in Asia, and tourists along the coasts of Boston, Paris, and London. What had once been a weapon of war became an instrument of connection. It was a transformation few could have imagined in those violent spring days of 1945. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison, who had driven his DUKW across the Rhine, recalled using the same vehicle months later to deliver food to starving German children. They'd chase us along the banks, calling out, "Schwimmwagen, Schwimmwagen," he said. It was strange. The same machine that carried death across the river was now carrying bread. Funny how war turns to peace. That was the DUKW's final legacy, that it could bridge not just rivers, but people. At a reunion of Rhine crossing veterans in 1985, aging soldiers stood beside one of the few surviving DUKWs. Its paint faded, its metal rusted by time. Sergeant James Mitchell, who had commanded one during the crossing, placed a hand on its side and smiled. "Ugly thing, isn't it?" he said softly. "Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something neither. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them. We outproduced them, out-innovated them, out-imagined them." Among the crowd stood a former German officer, Hans Müller, who had once defended the Rhine. When invited to speak, he paused for a long moment, looking at the veterans who had been his enemies. Then, in halting English, he said, "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw them drive out of the Rhine, I knew the war was over. Not lost, over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway." There was silence after he finished. Not the silence of hostility, but of understanding. The kind that comes when two sides finally see the same truth. The Rhine crossing, historians now agree, was not won by courage alone, nor by strategy or luck. It was won by vision, by a willingness to see beyond what was thought possible. For 2,000 years, the Rhine had been a line drawn by nature and guarded by men. Rome's legions stopped there. Napoleon's armies respected it. Even in the industrial age, it remained a psychological frontier, a symbol of invulnerability. And then, in 3 days, a fleet of trucks erased it. Winston Churchill, who crossed the river in one of those very vehicles, would later write, "The Americans, with their amphibious trucks, had solved through industry what we Europeans attempted through strategy. They did not defeat the Rhine. They ignored it." He would remember standing on the eastern bank, watching those ungainly shapes rise from the water like creatures from a prehistoric sea, their engines rumbling, their wheels dripping. Each DUKW, he wrote, was a messenger of doom for Nazi Germany, and a herald of the American century. He was right, for from that moment on, warfare, and the world, would never be the same. The Rhine was not conquered. It was industrially obsoleted. It was the moment when the modern age announced itself, not with a bang, but with the sound of engines idling in shallow water. And perhaps that is the DUKW's true victory. Not that it crossed a river, but that it made the impossible seem ordinary. Because that, ultimately, is the legacy of human ingenuity, to make miracles commonplace, to turn obstacles into opportunities, to transform the unthinkable into the routine. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 did not just carry soldiers or supplies. They carried the future, a vision of a world where creativity defeats rigidity, where factories can end wars, and where the simplest idea, a truck that can float, can change the course of history. Today, a few of those vehicles still survive, preserved in museums, resting quietly by riversides. Their olive paint is chipped, their propellers stilled. But if you stand close enough and listen, you can almost hear it, the hum of the engine, the splash of the water, the steady rhythm of progress. And somewhere, across the long memory of history, the Rhine still whispers their story, of how 1,000 swimming trucks turned the tide of a continent, and how, in the calm after the storm, they reminded the world that innovation, not destruction, is mankind's truest strength.